And welcome to the Dill Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and welcome to my 2011 retrospective series. What I wanted to do, I did this last year on my Letterboxd on movies of 2010, and I wanted to do it again for the movies of 2011, a whole 10 years later, seeing how some of these movies hold up, movies I've seen before, some movies I haven't seen before, seeing how they look in a lens a decade later in 2021, seeing just how much things have changed, if they still hold up, how the performances hold up, if they have defined certain genres and inspired other great films since. I actually started this already on the first of the month. I started it on my Letterboxd. You can go to Dylan_Randazzo at Letterboxd and see all my reviews for every movie I cover in the retrospective. But on YouTube, I will be doing select reviews for some of the more popular movies. If you want to check out my Letterboxd for sci-fi movies, action movies, horror, comedies, all sorts of movies, you can find it all on my Letterboxd and sometimes here on the channel. Today, we are diving into comedy. I figured I'd start off this retrospective with a really fun movie that a lot of people have seen and that I have not seen in a while, but I still really like, and that is 2011's Bridesmaids, starring Kristen, Wiig, Maya Rudolph, Rose Byrne, and so many other great actors and actresses who are worth noting. Comedy is such a subjective genre. You know, it appeals to many different generations and ages and types of people, very different ways. I mean, everyone reacts to certain comedies differently, but Bridesmaids seems to be one that a lot of people liked, a lot of people still like, a lot of people still hold in high regard. Just like some other notable movies like Superbad and Hangover for the decade before, I think Bridesmaids is one of the defining comedies of the past decade, the 2010s, and I'm excited to see what that defining comedy will be for the 2020s as well. But I think even 10 years later, Bridesmaids is still being talked about. A lot of people, when a new comedy comes out, especially starring a really amazing female cast, the first thing out of anyone's mouths are, well, is it Bridesmaids? Is it as good as Bridesmaids? So I really wanted to talk about this movie because I do think it has such an important legacy. But how does the movie hold up? And that's the big question 10 years later. How does the movie actually hold up? How do the different elements of the comedy, of the script, of the acting, how do they hold up? The plot centers around Annie, played by Kristen Wiig, who suffers a lot of misfortunes, if you will, after being asked to be the maid of honor for her friend Lillian, played by Maya Rudolph's wedding. This is already a very promising concept from the get-go, because rather than focusing on the bride and groom, which most rom-coms do focus on, this movie instead focuses on the other characters, the side characters, if you will. What do the other people in the wedding go through that you don't necessarily see in other movies? And I think that's why this movie is especially effective. It reminds me of a movie that came out last year, Palm Springs. You know, it's about these two people who are at the wedding. One is in the bridal party, one is not even in the bridal party. Andy Samberg's character is not, but it's about their story because their story is more interesting than what's going on with the bride and groom themselves. One of my favorite directors who's been directing for the past few decades, but really got his groove in the 2010s, especially with this film, is Paul Feig. Paul Feig signed on to be the director of this, having only done 2 movies prior, I Am David and Unaccompanied Minors. I had seen Unaccompanied Minors, you know, it was a nice Christmas film that I kind of forgot about, but Bridesmaids was really his first movie that really brought him critical acclaim. He also went on to make some pretty notable comedies like Spy, A Simple Favor, which is a kind of a dark, comedy thriller that I really liked, and then he made Last Christmas, which, you know, I don't love, but some people think it's a really fun, guilty pleasure Christmas movie. So he's definitely broken out in the mainstream. He's definitely made some great films, or at least memorable films that people still talk about, people go see. Of course, the studio trusted him with this project because he had done shows. He created Freaks and Geeks and directed plenty of episodes for that. He directed episodes from The Office. He directed episodes from Arrested Development, Nurse Jackie, Parks and Rec. He had a good background in TV, and a lot of this cast is made up of TV actors or actresses or people who got their start on TV, like at SNL. So it's clear that Paul Feig is comfortable directing large ensembles and knowing how to get comedy from each individual piece of the puzzle. And I think that's really helpful in a movie like Bridesmaids, because you really do want every single character in this ensemble to shine. You don't want it to be about one person. Even though there is a central focus, it is about Annie, it's about all the other bridesmaids in the party and how they react to what's going on, and the bride herself, Lillian, played by Maya Rudolph. I think now is a good time to talk about the cast for this film, because this cast is one of the best comedic ensembles assembled to date.
Auf Wiedersehen, asshole.
Back then, it was just this great, fresh surprise seeing all these amazing female comedians come together and tell such a funny story. But even years later, like, this is still one of the top ensembles. I don't think an ensemble, a comedy ensemble, has come close, maybe once or twice, but really this is probably my favorite comedic ensemble of the 2010s, especially for 2011, if we're just looking at that year specifically. Kristen Wiig was cast as the role Annie Walker, the central character that we follow throughout this film. A great casting choice.
What, do you have 4 boyfriends?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. Have fun having a baby at your prom.
But casting her friend Lillian, you really needed the right chemistry, because those two, their friendship off the bat has to be something you relate to, something that reels you in, and they did a great job casting Maya Rudolph. I know Mindy Kaling also auditioned for the role, but it eventually went to Kristen Wiig's co-star from SNL, Maya Rudolph, who also brings a great energy. The two just bounce off each other so well, and I think that's what's so special, is that these two characters just have such a great connection and bond outside of this story and the script as real people, so that translates really well to their characters. Rose Byrne also auditioned for the role of Lillian, but instead was given the opportunity to read for Helen, and she got the role of Helen. And I think Rose Byrne is a great choice, because Helen is someone you have to dislike, but you also have to find ways to empathize with, especially in the end when she does break down.
I don't have any female friends. I'm so sorry. Why are you smiling?
And I think Rose Byrne brings such a great balance of that. She's someone who you often, you kind of understand where she's coming from, but at times you think she's, very controlling and, overstepping her boundaries. And I think Rose Byrne understands that and delivers that performance quite well. The big breakout star for this movie, however, was Melissa McCarthy as Megan, the sister to the groom, who is also in the bridal party. And I think her character is someone who, on paper, has a lot of great material to work with, but Melissa McCarthy really just elevated it to the next level.
This is some classy shit here.
Jesus, Megan.
I'm sorry, I want to apologize. I'm not even confident of which end that came out of.
There were several actresses who went in for the role of Megan, but none quite captured the spirit of Megan quite like Melissa McCarthy. There were other actresses who auditioned, of course, including Busy Phillips and Rebel Wilson. Rebel Wilson, who had actually worked on Freaks and Geeks with Paul Feig and Judd Apatow, the producer. Apparently, she went into her audition and improvised for an entire hour. She impressed the director so much that she got a supporting role as the role of Bryn, Annie's roommate, who also has a really, really memorable presence in the film. She's not one of the core ensemble people in the bridal party that you see a lot of, but when she does have her moments where Annie is at home with her roommate and her roommate's brother, those moments are hilarious. And I think Rebel Wilson, too, kind of got a little bit of a breakout here. She would later go on to a huge breakout, of course, with Pitch Perfect a year later, but this was a really good first showing for her. But of course, like I said, Melissa McCarthy got the role, and she just nailed it. One of my favorite scenes, of course, is that airplane scene, because she gets to act alongside her real husband in real life, Ben Falcone.
Hey, not Air Marshal John. You want to get back in that restroom and not rest?
No. I have to get back to my seat.
And you can just see, because of their marriage, they just have such an electric chemistry, even though at first he's a bit apprehensive.
What's that?
I gotta get back to my seat.
Rounding out the cast, you have Wendy McLevin-Covey as Rita and Ellie Kemper as Becca. These are two actresses that I think give really great performances, but of course their characters are just a little smaller than the rest, but they do find really fun moments to have them shine. Ellie Kemper especially is just a joy in everything I see her in, especially The Office, Unbreakable Kimmy Schmidt, and now here. She just has a presence that is just so sweet on screen, and it really makes for some funny comedy moments when she finally does reveal something that is a little darker, that doesn't really necessarily match her sweet, bubbly persona, and it's a really great dichotomy for that character too. Like I said, this ensemble is so good, and every cast member gets to shine in some individual aspect, as well as together. Some of the best moments are ensemble scenes, but the most iconic scene is, of course, that bridal shop scene where they're shopping for the dresses, and then all the girls just start shitting and throwing up all over the place.
What did we eat? Oh, things are goner! What are you doing? It's coming out of me like lava!
It is one of the funniest, most shocking, and just vulgar, crude moments in comedy. It's so funny. What I love so much about that scene is that earlier on in the film, when they're just eating at the restaurant, they drop subtle hints that something might happen down the line, but you don't necessarily realize it on the first watch. You see Rose Byrne's character say no to eating the meat because, you know, she says it's not good to eat a lot before a bridal dress fitting. And that's not a detail that really should stick out to you, but rewatching it, you understand why that's such an important detail, because later on, all the girls who did eat the meat and ate a lot of food at that dinner or at that lunch then go into a really, really insane rampage of throwing up and pooping all over this bridal store. It's a great build where you see each individual character start to experience it, almost like in comedies when someone farts and then it takes a while for everyone in the room to smell it. It's kind of the same thing. Once one person starts feeling a little achy, then the next person starts feeling achy, and then all of a sudden everyone is feeling it, and everyone's starting to get that, you know, that same pain and that same discomfort.
Look. Megan, are you okay?
What I love about the scene is it takes it exactly to the maximum, and then, you know, it doesn't exceed that. You know, it goes there, but then at the end, all it is Maya Rudolph running into the street and just squatting down on the ground, and you don't really see anything, but you know what's happening, and that's almost funnier. The fact that she's in this beautiful wedding dress and she's out in the street, just letting it all out. I love everything about the performances in that scene. Melissa McCarthy saying, "Look away!"
No! Look away!
This is such an over-the-top, raunchy moment, but you don't get too many of those throughout the film. You know, if we were to get 5 or 6 sequences like this, I feel like the film wouldn't be as effective. The film doesn't overindulge in this over-the-top nature, which is really nice. What I think is the most important thing about Bridesmaids, however, is not necessarily the comedy. We know the comedy's funny because we've seen it, we've laughed at it. You know, there are so many great actresses that we knew would deliver this comedy well, but it's really the heart that makes Bridesmaids something better than just your average comedy. The very surface level premise is all these bridesmaids trying to get their bride down the aisle and have a great wedding. But in a much grander retrospect, this is a story about different relationships and different characters and how they work together against each other, how they push and pull apart, and characters examining their own problems and obstacles to overcome in order to then, you know, fulfill the larger goal, which is to make the best wedding possible for their friend. I think this film really succeeds in wearing both its humor and its heart on its sleeve. The film does have 3 central relationships at its core. It is an ensemble piece, but there are 3 central relationships at its core. It's focused on Annie and Lillian's friendship. It's focused on Annie and Helen's rivalry, and also this romance between Annie and Officer Nathan Rhodes, played by Chris O'Dowd, who I haven't mentioned already, and who is absolutely hilarious and very genuine and just so charismatic and charming on screen as well. What I appreciate most about Bridesmaids is that it is not a romantic comedy first, it is a comedy first. So the romantic elements, even though it is there, it is not the number one storyline. I think the number one relationship is that relationship between Annie and Lillian. You know, you have to have this really strong friendship because that is the core of the story. When they do eventually break ties as friends, we are meant to feel for both sides because we've already spent so much time focusing on them as a unit and growing with them. Before she even gets proposed to, we see a scene between Annie and Lillian, really trying to establish that relationship, show that friendship, not just between Maya Rudolph and Kristen Wiig, but between Annie and Lillian, that is so strong, so then eventually when they do pull apart, it is so effective.
You know what? This is supposed to be about my time. You have managed to ruin every event in my wedding. Thank you very much.
Even though Annie is the character we're seeing most of the perspective of the film from, we still have to understand what Lillian's going through and understand why she needs some space and why sometimes Annie is hurting this whole experience for her. And I think that's what's so powerful, is that we are able to see both characters' sides and really relate to them both. Same as the rivalry with Rose Byrne's character Helen. We see both sides, and we see where Helen is coming from, even though some of her antics and some of her, you know, actual actions are very, very detrimental to the whole story and really toxic to the group. There are also moments where Helen is right, and you have to kind of put yourself in Annie's shoes and say, you know, maybe she is right, and that's what stems a lot of the jealousy from Annie. I also like how the rivalry kind of brews and grows over the course of the film. In the beginning of the movie, we see this hilarious speech sequence where each person is trying to one-up each other on a speech.
Thank you for coming. Here, I'll take that. I'll take that. Yep, I got it.
And it grows even further to the point where they take really, really drastic actions and really lash out and act out and really just let their emotions go. And I think it's a really, really natural progression that helps just make you root against Helen, but also empathize with Helen at the end when Helen eventually comes to Annie for help. It's just a really, really well thought out and well developed relationship on terms of the acting and the writing and the direction.
This is $800. I'm kidding. It's on sale.
Oh my gosh.
Are you serious?
As I said, the romance is not at the forefront of the film, but is still a very important element of it. A lot of Annie's inability to resolve things with both Lillian and Helen stems from her not being confident enough in her own path, in her own journey, in her own story. And I think that's why this romance is important, to give Annie another story unrelated to these bridesmaids and unrelated to Lillian that she can really, better herself in. I also like how it's not just this story where a guy meets a girl and they fall in love. There are obstacles to their relationship. There's a point where Annie backs out of the relationship because she's not ready to take that next step. And then there's a scene where Nathan won't even look at Annie. There's a lot of back and forth, but eventually they do resolve things. And once they resolve things, it feels earned because of the journey we took getting there.
It's nice to see you.
I'm glad that you got your taillights fixed.
So these three central relationships with Lillian, Helen, and Officer Rhodes, I think, really do ground the film and make it more than just this funny comedy. There are real relationships that you can relate to, even if you haven't been in a wedding or been this large role in a wedding or gotten married. You can still relate to the emotions that these characters are feeling, because jealousy is a normal human thing. Friendships that pull apart and resolve, that's a normal thing. Relationships are a normal thing. So while the circumstances are not necessarily something everyone can relate to, the actual relationships and the emotions these characters feel are. And that is why Bridesmaids is so effective, and why it is not just passed off as this, funny comedy, but something with some real heart and some real substance to it. You can clearly see I love Bridesmaids. Even all these years later, it holds up for me because of all those elements I talked about beforehand. But it's interesting to look at how the overall critic response has shaped around Bridesmaids over the years, and how the audience response has shaped around Bridesmaids over the course of 10 years. Right after the film wrapped, Judd Apatow, the producer, said, "It was only after the movie completed that anyone said this had any significance. We didn't think it was any different than something like The House Bunny or Baby Mama, so we didn't think we were breaking any new ground. We just thought it was a fun thing to do." And I think that's really interesting, because they didn't know what magic they had, but they had it all. And on set, I find it unfathomable that on set no one realized that this would be a breakout hit, but maybe it's because we hadn't seen a lot of, women-led comedies like this in this similar vein ever. And I think that's what's so important, and this is why this is such a groundbreaking film and why it's talked about 10 years later in such high regard. Critic Owen Gleiberman from Entertainment Weekly said, "The message that Hollywood should be taking is a comedy that's raunchy and fearless, and also brilliantly written and shrewdly honest about what's going on in women's lives, may actually connect with the fabled non-teenage audience." And I think that's really, really important as well. This is not just a raunchy comedy with women in the main roles. Instead, it is a raunchy comedy with women in the main roles about women's experiences. And I think that's what's different about Bridesmaids than if you were to just remake The Hangover with women. It's not the same, because this movie actually deals with women's lives and women's paths and the relationships between women that I think is really important for people to see. And I'm surprised it took till 2011 to really get those movies made. Movies like that made, that speak to the women's experience and have the same humor and gags and large over-the-top comedy as something like The Hangover or Knocked Up or Step Brothers. What Owen Gleiberman said especially was non-teenage audiences, and I think that's important to note too, because Bridesmaids, Universal reported that males only made up 33% of the movie's audience, and that 63% of the audience was over the age of 30. So this obviously spoke to not an old crowd, but an older crowd than usual. That was what was so special about Bridesmaids 2, is that it spoke to people of all generations, but especially people who are older, who have gone through these experiences or gone through similar experiences that can relate to these characters. I think it's important that people can see themselves in characters in film and find ways to step into their shoes with shared experiences. And Bridesmaids, I think, is a really, really good example of a film that does just that. Bridesmaids surpassed Knocked Up to become the top-grossing Judd Apatow production to date, grossing $26 million on its opening weekend, which was second place behind Thor. As we know now, Marvel Cinematic Universe, if it's in theaters, you're probably not going to outgross it on the first weekend, but for second place, I'd say that's pretty good. I really do think Bridesmaids is a comedy that will continue to stand the test of time. When doing this 2011 retrospective, I really wanted to see which films were almost genre defining, and I think this is one. I think this really defined a certain genre of women ensemble films about women. And I think that's really, really important, really special, and why so many people relate to it, so many people love it, so many people rewatch it. The comedy is hilarious, the cast is perfect, they all work so well together. One thing that comedies do these days that drives me nuts is they put these really specific references that 10 years later seem so dated. The only really big pop culture reference they put in here is Wilson Phillips, and Wilson Phillips is timeless. I just love Bridesmaids, and I do think this is a comedy that will hold up through time. It has definitely held up over the past 10 years, and I do highly recommend, if you haven't seen it in a while, go check it out again. It is a really, really awesome film. So that's my review on Bridesmaids 10 years later. The 2011 retrospective is not ending here. As I said on Letterboxd, Dylan_Randazzo, you can see all of my reviews for a lot of different movies in 2011. I just did reviews for Source Code, Crazy Stupid Love, another hilarious comedy, Rise of the Planet of the Apes, The Muppets, a lot of great reviews on there for you to read if you are interested in that, and you can check me out here on the Dill Pickle Movie Network. For the next few weeks, I will still be talking about 2011 movies. At the end of the month, you will get an episode of Picture This, where we will go through all of the Best Picture nominees from 2011, talking about them 10 years later, seeing what we believe are the best movies and performances of the year. And then, at the very, very end of the month, I will give my top 10 movies of 2011. I cannot wait to talk about it. I cannot wait to keep writing on Letterboxd about 2011. It's really been fun to look at these movies 10 years later and see how much they've held up, or how much they haven't held up, and just re-experiencing them again all these years later. Thank you so much for watching. Check me out on Letterboxd, check me out here, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. It's greatly appreciated. Have a great week. Thank you so much. See you next time.